Hey there. Tonight, we're easing into the grim, dangerous, and honestly quite miserable world of medieval assassins. Those shadowy figures you've seen in movies, creeping through castle corridors and moonlit alleys, changing the course of history with a quiet step and a hidden blade. Well, the truth is, their lives were anything but exciting. Hollywood makes it look sleek, but in reality, being a medieval assassin seriously, and I mean seriously, sucked. Before we get too far, feel free to like the video and subscribe, only if this kind of quiet, slow history is your thing. No pressure. And if you want, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing how far this sleepy little corner of history reaches. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe let a fan hum quietly in the background and settle in. Let's drift back, slowly and softly, into the cold, lonely alleys of the medieval world. It is the year 1294. The moon hangs low in the sky, casting a thin, silver light over uneven cobblestone streets. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then falls silent. Most of the town is asleep, tucked beneath woolen blankets, surrounded by the crackle of hearth fires and the muffled hush of a winter's night. But not everyone is resting. One man, cloaked in a threadbare hood, crouches behind a decaying barrel in a narrow alleyway. He has been there for over an hour. His knees ache. His breath clouds the air in front of him, but he dares not move. Not yet. This is not a tale of a noble knight or a dashing rogue with hidden blades and graceful moves. No. This is the quieter, much bleaker story of someone caught between desperation and danger. This is the story of a medieval assassin, and it is far from glamorous. The truth is, the man hiding in the shadows tonight is not part of a secret order. He was not trained from childhood in the arts of stealth, poison, or swordplay. In fact, he cannot read or write. He has no family name that matters, and no legacy to leave behind. He does not wear armor. He does not carry exotic weapons. He owns a knife. It is small, dull, and more suited for slicing bread than slitting throats. He is not here because he is skilled. He is here because he is poor and cold and hungry. The Middle Ages, for many, were not an era of chivalry and grand quests. For most, they were centuries of toil, illness, and fear. And for some, like the man waiting in the alley, it was a time of choices so narrow, so grim, that becoming a killer for hire seemed almost rational. Almost. His name is not remembered. He was never written about. He didn't leave behind journals filled with reflections on morality. He wasn't noble or evil. He was a person born into a world that had no room for him. When we think of assassins today, our minds often jump to images shaped by stories and films. Cloaks that disappear into the crowd, perfectly thrown daggers, hidden blades that spring from wrists. But in the real medieval world, being an assassin wasn't stylish. It wasn't cool. It wasn't even respected. It was just another way to die early. This man didn't choose his life because it excited him. He was offered a coin, a single coin, by a merchant with a grudge and a whispered name. The man didn't ask questions. Questions, in his experience, led to more pain than answers. He simply nodded, took the coin, and waited for nightfall. The job is simple. Find a man with a green feather in his hat. Follow him, end him, quietly. But how does one quietly end a life in a town where every floorboard creaks, every dog barks, and every step echoes in the narrow alleys? There is no training manual, no mentor, only instinct, and an increasing sense that this will go wrong somehow. The assassin doesn't feel powerful. He feels like prey. Every sound feels louder. Every silhouette looks like a guard. And he knows, somewhere in the back of his mind, that even if he succeeds, especially if he succeeds, he will probably not be paid. Or worse, silenced by the one who hired him. This job is not about glory. It's about survival. The townspeople, if they knew of his plan, would spit at him or hang him, not for the murder necessarily, but for being lowborn, desperate, and dangerous. To them, he is filth. To the guards, he is a criminal. To the man in the green feather, if he notices him at all, he is just a shadow, until it's too late. But maybe the man won't go through with it. Maybe his knees, now stiff and trembling, will give out before the target appears. Maybe the target won't show up at all. Maybe none of this matters, because this entire night could end with a wrong step, a wrong glance, or a wrong breath. This is not an epic. It's not a legend. It's just a quiet moment in the life of someone forgotten. So tonight, as the wind blows softly through the streets of a town whose name you do not need to know, remember this. History isn't always bold. It isn't always brave. Sometimes it's cold and lonely and silent. And so we begin. The myth of the assassin. Why Hollywood lies. When we hear the word assassin, a certain image forms in our minds. It might be a silent figure standing atop a cathedral roof, watching over a city of secrets. It might be someone cloaked in black, their eyes sharp, their movements smooth, their blade glinting in the moonlight. They are graceful, mysterious, often romanticized. Fiction tells us they are part philosopher, part warrior, part ghost. But that image is a lie. The truth, like so much of history, is quieter, rougher, and far more disappointing. There were no acrobatic escapes across rooftops. There were no elaborate networks of secret brotherhoods spanning continents. There were no underground bases filled with candles, strategy maps, and wise mentors handing down ancient codes of honor. There was mostly just hunger and desperation and mud. Lots of mud. The real assassins of the Middle Ages were not skilled agents of some noble cause. They were not trained from youth or chosen for their abilities. They were not recruited through trials of courage. They were usually men, and occasionally women, who had run out of options. Thieves, deserters, runaways, the forgotten and the unremarkable. They did not disappear into the night after a clean kill. They stumbled, they bled. They were caught more often than not, because medieval towns weren't like video games. They were loud, unpredictable, cramped. The smell alone could betray your position if you stepped too close to a pig pen or a puddle of human waste. Still, the myth persists, and it's easy to see why. We crave stories of precision, of justice, of cool detachment. In the chaos of modern life, the assassin figure offers control. A single, quiet individual who can change the world from the shadows. No politics, no bureaucracy, just the will to act. Neat, clean, final. But real assassins were not neat. They were dirty in every sense of the word. Their blades weren't elegant. Most couldn't afford a proper weapon. A kitchen knife would do, or a rusted short sword. Some even relied on clubs or rocks. Anything to get the job done. Anything that wouldn't draw attention before it was too late. They didn't wear hidden armor. They wore what they could find. Padded tunics, stolen cloaks, boots that were never quite the right size. Nothing about them was fashionable or coordinated. They didn't meditate before a mission. They prayed, or drank, or cried, or just waited in silence, hoping the job would be easy and the escape even easier. There were no dramatic confrontations with enemies atop towers. There were back doors, shadows, back alleys, and the occasional awkward blunder where the target noticed too soon and ran screaming into a tavern full of witnesses. And if that happened, well, the assassin often died right there. Not in combat, but under the boots of guards, or the fists of an angry mob, or by hanging before sunrise. No trial, no escape, just silence. So why do we believe the myths? Partly because of stories. From ancient Persia to Renaissance Italy, tales of silent killers have been exaggerated, dramatized, and eventually distorted into fiction. Some were based on half-truths. A few were inspired by real events. But most were simply what people do best: make stories more exciting than they really were. And partly because, honestly, the truth is too bleak. No one wants to think about a poor, ragged man with no name, crouching in the cold, waiting to kill for a piece of bread. No one wants to hear that most assassins were simply people discarded by the systems around them, tools used and thrown away. So we invented the legend. We gave them style. We gave them motives. We gave them grace. But history didn't. History gave them fear, and short lives, and unmarked graves. And so, when you watch a film or play a game that tells you what it was like to be an assassin in the past, remember this: stories are made to entertain, but history, when you strip away the polish, is not entertaining. It is quiet. It is harsh. It is slow. It is the sound of a man walking barefoot in the dark, not because he wants to, but because he must, because he has nothing left, and because someone, somewhere, whispered a name, not skilled, just desperate. There is a strange comfort in believing that those who do terrible things are somehow different from us, that they were born with some twisted gift, that they trained in secret arts, that they had special skills we could never imagine. But more often than not, that's not the case. In the Middle Ages, people did terrible things not because they were trained to, but because they were desperate. Desperation is not dramatic. It's not poetic. It's not even very interesting. Desperation is slow. It builds. It starts with an empty stomach, a sick child, a landlord who doesn't care, a bad harvest, a winter that lasts too long, a job lost, a family gone, a name forgotten. It whispers to a person over time, wearing them down like a stone under dripping water. Until one day, the question changes. Not, what do I want to be? But, what will anyone pay me to do? And for some, the only answer was simple. Someone had a grudge. Someone wanted revenge. Someone was willing to offer a coin. And someone, anyone, just had to be willing to do it. You didn't need to be skilled, just quiet, just unnoticed, just there. So, no. Most medieval assassins weren't warriors. They weren't masters of disguise or swordplay. They were usually people who couldn't even hold a sword properly. Their hands shook. Their bodies were underfed, thin, and tired. They limped from old injuries. They smelled of sweat and fear and hopelessness. But they said yes. Because in the world they lived in, that yes was sometimes the only option left. There were no applications, no contracts, no grand introductions in a candlelit room. There was no secret handshake. It was usually a meeting in a shadowed alley or a whispered conversation at the edge of a tavern. I'll give you this if you make him go away. That's all. And so began the short, unpleasant career of the so-called assassin. They weren't taught, they guessed. They didn't have mentors. They had vague instructions. Follow him, wait until he's alone, do it quick. Sometimes, they didn't even know the name of the target. Just a coat color, a hat style, a beard. Imagine the pressure of ending someone's life based on nothing but a scarf and a stranger's vague memory. Mistakes happened. People followed the wrong man, or hesitated, or failed. And there were no second chances, no retries. Sometimes the client disappeared, leaving the assassin unpaid and now hunted. Because the assassin didn't just risk jail, they risked death. If anyone found out, if the job went wrong, if the target escaped and reported them, it was over. You see, medieval law didn't care why you did something, or how skilled you were. It only cared that you did it, and once the accusation was made, true or not, it was nearly impossible to escape. You might be dragged through the streets, beaten before a trial. You might not even get a trial. And yet, people still said yes. Because desperation is heavier than fear. Skills can be taught. Desperation needs no training. It just exists. It breathes with you. It follows you home. It sleeps beside you. And when someone offers you coin, however little, to do something unspeakable, it doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like the last remaining door. There is no pride in it, no thrill, no drama. Only a quiet nod, a long walk in the dark, and the constant hope that maybe, just maybe, it will be over quickly. No one teaches you how to kill. Not really. Not when you're poor. Not when you're scared. Not when all you want is for the hunger to stop. But somehow, some did it anyway. Not because they could, but because they felt they had to. When your client wants you dead, getting paid was never the hardest part. Staying alive after getting paid, that was. Because the client who hired you was often the same one who wanted you gone when the job was done. Not because you failed, not because you talked, but because you were inconvenient now, because you were a loose end, because it's safer to kill someone who knows too much than to trust them. even if they did exactly what you asked, especially then. They smiled when they handed you the coin. They thanked you quietly, maybe with a nod, maybe with a word you weren't sure how to read. And then they watched you leave. And maybe they followed, or maybe they sent someone after you later that night. Sometimes it was immediate. Sometimes it took weeks. But if you lived this life long enough, you stopped waiting for the betrayal and just started assuming it. You learned the signs early. The way their voice tightened when they gave you the target. The way they didn't look you in the eye when the job was done. The way their guard stood a little closer after you returned. You noticed small things. A drink offered that you didn't ask for. A coin purse, a little too heavy, like it was meant to distract. A pause before they turned away. You noticed because you had to. Because the moment you relaxed, the moment you believed you were safe, was the moment the knife found your back. Some didn't wait at all. They sent their killers before you'd even left the city. They thought you were tired, wounded, easy, and sometimes they were right. You stumbled into an ambush before the blood on your boots had dried. You had to fight, wounded, hungry, while wondering why you ever trusted them at all. But most times, you didn't trust them. You just didn't have a better option. The smarter ones waited. They let you think the job was finished. They let you travel. Let you drop your guard. Let you believe you'd made it through. Then they sent the hunter, or the blade in the dark, or the message that wasn't really a message at all, just a warning, just a promise that you would not be left to live freely. And by then, you were tired, not surprised, just tired. You changed your name again. You burned the clothes. You vanished into another town, and you waited for the next betrayal. It never got easier. You never stopped hoping this time might be different, that this client might honor their word, that maybe, just maybe, you could finish the job, get paid, and walk away without having to look over your shoulder. But hope was dangerous. Hope got people killed. So you buried it, quietly, without ceremony, and you learned to trust patterns, not people. You built habits around survival. You never met clients in the same place twice. You always scouted exits before sitting down. You checked every drink, every coin, every glance. You never slept in the same inn for more than a night, even when the sheets were warm. You spoke less and watched more. And still, it wasn't enough. Because the betrayal didn't always come from the client. Sometimes it came from the people around them. A bodyguard looking to make extra coin. A rival who wanted to disrupt their power. Someone who saw your presence as a threat and decided to act before you did. You couldn't predict all of it. You could only survive it, so you stopped planning for peace and started preparing for failure. Every job had two parts, the kill and the escape. And you gave equal weight to both. You killed quietly. You left no trail. You made sure no one could link you to the client if things went wrong. And if they tried, if they came for you anyway, you ran without hesitation. You fought if you had to. You disappeared like you were never there. Sometimes, the client didn't want you dead because of fear. Sometimes, it was pride. They hated needing you, hated the reminder that their power wasn't complete. You were a tool they didn't control. Not really. You were a risk they had to pay for. And once your usefulness ended, so did their tolerance. It wasn't personal. It never was. But it always felt like it. There were a rare few, who didn't betray you, who paid what they owed, gave a nod of respect, and let you go. You remembered those ones. Not fondly, but clearly. Because they were the exception, and you didn't trust them either. Even if they did nothing wrong, you watched them like they would. You left town anyway. You burned the letter you never answered again. And sometimes you beat them to it. If you saw the signs early, if you felt the shift in their voice, the distance in their eyes, you struck first. Not for coin, not for revenge, just for survival. You ended it before it began. And you told yourself it was just business, just another loose end you couldn't afford to leave dangling. But even then, it sat with you. Another weight you didn't speak of. Another death with no name attached. This was the rhythm. Kill the target. Avoid the client. Disappear. Repeat. You weren't just fighting enemies. You were fighting allies too. Or people who pretended to be. And in the end, you stopped calling them clients. You called them threats. Because that's what they were. Every job was a trap. Every handshake carried a blade. Every coin came with a cost higher than gold. And the strange thing? You kept going. Not because you liked it. Not because you trusted the game. But because there was no other life left. Because after enough time, suspicion became habit. Betrayal became normal. You didn't feel shocked when they turned on you. You felt confirmed. You expected it. You planned for it. And the only surprise was when it didn't happen. Some said it was paranoia. You called it survival. And you were still alive. That was all that mattered. Alone in a crowd. Isolation is a way of life. Being alone wasn't a choice. Not really. It was a consequence, a result, a slow erosion. It didn't happen all at once. It started with small things, conversations you didn't join, rooms you didn't stay in, glances you avoided, not because you hated people, but because closeness was dangerous. Trust led to questions. Questions led to exposure. Exposure led to death. So you kept your distance, and you called it safety. But over time, it became something else. You could walk through a city full of people and feel like a ghost. No one looked at you twice. No one called your name. No one remembered you once you were gone. At first, that was the goal. To pass unnoticed. To move without leaving a trace. But after a while, the silence didn't feel like protection anymore. It felt like weight, like hunger, like something missing you couldn't name. You watched others talk, laugh, argue. You listened to them without being part of it. You learned how people connected by standing just outside their reach. You saw the way friendships were built from shared stories, from trust, from time spent without fear. And you told yourself you didn't need it, that your life didn't allow for that, that you were safer this way, and maybe you were. But safety didn't keep you warm. It didn't sit beside you when the nights grew long. It didn't speak to you when the silence got too loud. You tried sometimes to break the pattern. You let someone in, Briefly, carefully, a moment of softness, a night without your blade within reach. But it never lasted. Either they left, or you did, because you knew too much. You'd seen too much. You carried things no one should have to carry. And even if they didn't ask, even if they never questioned where you went or what you did, it still grew between you. That invisible thing, that space, that danger, it poisoned everything you touched. So you stopped trying. You became polite but distant, friendly but quiet. You let conversations end before they started. You learned how to be around people without ever truly being with them. You became skilled at disappearing in plain sight. The cloak didn't make you invisible. The silence did. People assumed you were shy, or cold, or just strange. They didn't know that your quiet came from grief, that your stillness came from fear, that every step away from closeness was a step toward survival. You told yourself you didn't mind, that solitude was strength, that needing no one meant no one could betray you. And in many ways, that was true. But the body still wanted contact. The heart still hoped. You noticed it in the little things, the way you lingered near crowds just a second longer than necessary, the way you listened to voices on the wind, not because of threat, but because you missed the sound of people being unafraid. You caught yourself watching hands, how they touched, how they held, how they waved without tension. You didn't want to join. You just wanted to remember what that felt like. Some nights, when the job was done and the streets were quiet, you wandered without purpose. Not to scout, not to plan, just to move, to exist near others, even if they didn't see you. You walked past lit windows and listened to laughter through thin walls. You sat outside taverns just close enough to hear music, never close enough to be noticed. And for a moment, it felt like something real, like something human. But it didn't last. It never did. The work called you back. The risk returned, and you reminded yourself that isolation was your armor. That distance was the only guarantee you had left. You slept alone. You ate quickly. You moved often. And the longer you lived this way, the harder it became to remember what it had felt like before. Before the blade. Before the silence. Before the shadows wrapped around you like a second skin. Some days, you tried to speak, to say something that mattered, but the words didn't come. Your voice felt unfamiliar in your own throat, like it belonged to someone else. You had spent so long being silent that the idea of being known again felt terrifying. You weren't sure what you would say. You weren't sure what version of yourself still existed beneath the layers you'd built. Others tried to reach you once in a while. A merchant who noticed your pattern. A stranger who asked too many questions. A child who didn't understand fear yet. And for a moment, you hesitated. You considered letting them closer. But then you remembered what closeness cost. You remembered the names you couldn't speak anymore. The faces you couldn't forget. The ones who paid the price for knowing you. And you stepped back. Always back. Because love was a liability. Friendship was a flaw. Attachment was a slow death. And in your world, you needed to be fast. You needed to be cold. You needed to leave before anything warm could take root. That's what they don't understand. The world remembers assassins for what they do, not what they lose. But the greatest loss isn't blood. It's not sleep. It's not even your name. It's the simple act of being known, of being touched without suspicion, of speaking without calculation, of living without armor. You didn't choose this life because you wanted to be alone. You chose it because it was the only way to keep going. But that choice cost you more than you expected. It turned crowds into prisons. It turned kindness into danger. It turned silence into home. And now, even if you could walk away, even if you found peace, you're not sure you'd know how to come back. You've spent too long in the quiet, too long in the dark. And the light, though beautiful, feels like something that belongs to someone else. Clients and cowards, betrayed by the ones who hired you. There's something strangely comforting in the idea that a deal is a deal. That when two people agree on something, especially something as dangerous as murder, both sides will hold their end of the bargain. But in the real world of the medieval assassin, this trust was as thin as the coin they were promised, and often far less durable. The person who hired you might have seemed calm, respectable, even desperate themselves. Maybe they met you under cover of darkness in the corner of a tavern, or passed a note through a third party who disappeared before you could ask questions. Maybe they looked you in the eye and said, "I just need this done," and handed over a coin in advance, or perhaps promised more after the fact. And you wanted to believe them, because belief was all you had. You didn't have contracts. There were no oaths, no written agreements, just words, whispers, and risk. Sometimes you were paid in full. Rarely. More often, you were told the rest of the money would come after the job. A reward for success. Proof that you could be trusted. But you knew even as you accepted the terms, there was a chance, perhaps a large one, that you'd never see that person again. That they would vanish into the town like smoke, change their name, deny they ever knew you, or worse, report you before you could report them. Why would they keep their word? You were, after all, a criminal in their eyes. Disposable. Nameless. A problem with legs and a knife. Once the job was done, you became a liability. You knew too much, and they had what they wanted. You might think fear would keep a client honest. The fear that you would come back, that you'd seek revenge. But most assassins weren't feared. They weren't strong. They didn't belong to powerful groups. They had no one backing them, no safety net, and their threat only went as far as their name, which was usually unknown. If you got cheated, what could you do? Tell the guards? You'd be confessing to a crime. Confront the client? You'd risk a scene, and perhaps your life. Spread word to others? There was no network, no underworld community to protect your reputation. You were alone. In some cases, the betrayal went even further. Some clients would set you up from the start. You weren't hired to kill someone for their benefit. You were bait, a distraction, a scapegoat. The target might be important, but so were you. Important as someone to take the fall. You'd be lured into making a move just as guards were nearby. The client would be watching, and when the chaos started, they'd make sure someone shouted your description loud enough to draw attention. While you ran for your life, they'd be seen helping or warning others, gaining the trust and admiration of the very people they'd conspired to harm. It didn't always happen like that, but it happened often enough that any smart assassin learned to be afraid of the person paying them more than the person they were meant to kill. Even in the better cases, when the job went well and the client did pay, there was no trust built. There was no relationship. You weren't going to become their go-to person for future tasks. In fact, they'd probably never speak to you again, and would pretend they'd never seen your face. They'd cross the street if they saw you in daylight. They'd tighten their grip on their pouch, or worse, report you to the authorities just to tie off a loose end. Because a killer is useful right up until the moment they're not. After that, they're a threat. And if the client was wealthy or connected, even worse. They could have you hanged without a second thought. If you got caught and tried to name them, your word meant nothing. You were a criminal. They were a respected figure, landowner, merchant, priest, or soldier. And if it came down to your life or theirs, the world wouldn't hesitate. Many assassins learned, too late, that the person they trusted with their survival was the same person planning their downfall. And yet, the cycle continued. Because what other option did you have? You couldn't say no. Not if you wanted to eat. Not if you wanted to sleep under a roof. Not if winter was coming and your boots were thin, your hands raw, your body hollow from hunger. It's easy, from the outside, to say someone should be smarter, more careful, choose their clients more wisely. But that assumes choice. That assumes options. And most assassins didn't have any. They weren't connected. They weren't respected. They couldn't say no. They couldn't afford to wait for a better opportunity, a more trustworthy employer. So they said yes, again and again, to people who lied, to people who vanished, to people who paid them in betrayal. And each time, they took the risk, hoping that this time would be different, that this client would be honest, that the job would be clean, that the reward would come, that the silence afterward would be safe and not deadly. But most of the time, they were wrong. They'd return to the alley where the meeting was supposed to happen. They'd wait, and no one would come. No coin, no word, nothing. Sometimes they'd go looking, but the innkeeper would say, "Never heard of him." The tavern girl would shrug. The merchant who arranged it would be gone. The name they were given wasn't real. The job, now finished, had been swept away like dust in a breeze. And there the assassin stood, dirt on their hands, blood on their tunic, alone. They couldn't complain. They couldn't explain. They just moved on. Or they didn't. Because for some, that betrayal was the last thread snapping. It was the final failure, the moment when everything became too heavy. Some gave up the life, if they were lucky enough to live long enough to try. Others were caught. Others were silenced before they could become a problem. But all of them learned the same lesson. In the world of medieval murder for hire, trust was a luxury, and believing in anyone, even the person who offered you coin, was often the most dangerous mistake you could make. There were no friends in the dark alleys, no second chances, no redemption arcs, just clients and cowards. and the long, cold silence after the job was done. Living in the shadows, fear, paranoia, and the assassin's mind. It begins with a glance, a shadow that moves where it shouldn't, a sound that's just a little too sharp, a voice behind you that doesn't say your name, but says something, something that makes your heart beat a little faster. At first, you ignore it because you have to. Because if you reacted to every small thing, you'd never make it through the day. But then, it happens again. A stranger looking at you too long. A door left slightly open. A boot print near your hiding place that wasn't there the day before. And that's when it starts to settle in. Paranoia. It doesn't scream. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It walks beside you. It lays down with you at night. It follows you into places where no one knows your name, and it keeps you awake long after you should be asleep. Because being an assassin in the Middle Ages wasn't just about the act of killing. It was about surviving afterward. It was about staying invisible long after the knife was buried, long after the body grew cold, long after the client walked away and left you alone with the consequences. You didn't just fear being caught. You feared being seen. Because even being seen meant being remembered. And being remembered meant someone, somewhere, could point you out when the questions started. You learned to move differently, slowly, carefully, never taking the same path twice, never eating in the same tavern 2 nights in a row, never sleeping in the same place for more than a few days. You watched everyone, listened for changes in tone, noticed who left a conversation when you entered a room, counted how many times the same man walked past the door in one afternoon. It was exhausting, not in a loud way, but in a deep, quiet way, like your bones were tired, like even your breath didn't trust you anymore. And yet, you kept going, because you had no choice. Fear became part of your routine, like tying your boots or watching the sky for rain. It was always there, a constant presence. You learned to live with it, to work around it. But it changed you. You began to forget what it felt like to sit with your back to a room, or to speak without wondering how your words might be used against you, or to look someone in the eye without calculating whether they were a guard or a client or something worse. Even sleep wasn't a refuge. It came in short bursts, broken by the creak of floorboards, the slam of a shutter, the howl of dogs in the street. You started waking up before you even knew why, reaching for a weapon that might not be there, breathing like you were still running. You couldn't rest. Not really. Not ever. Because even if no one was chasing you now, someone might be tomorrow. And if not tomorrow, then someday. That was the most terrifying part. Not knowing. Not if, but when. The mind adapts in strange ways. It starts to treat fear as normal. You stop reacting to it. You stop noticing the tension in your shoulders, the way your eyes dart across a room. You start to believe this is just how people live, that everyone is like this, and maybe, in your world, they are. You meet others who seem just as hollow, just as distant. You share no stories, no real names. You speak in half sentences, and you nod more than you talk. Trust doesn't exist here, only proximity, only the temporary safety of being close, but not too close. You begin to lose parts of yourself, small things, at first. A habit you once had, a word you used to say, a laugh that no longer comes. Then the bigger things. You forget where you came from, what you wanted before all this, who you were trying to be. The assassin's mind isn't shaped by training. It's shaped by erosion, a slow wearing down of everything that made you more than a tool. Eventually, even your own name sounds strange in your head. You become a shadow, not because you want to, but because it's the only way to survive. And still, somehow, you carry on. Why? That question comes up, especially on long, sleepless nights. Why keep doing this? Why keep walking through this life of silence and suspicion? For some, the answer is simple. Because there's nothing else. This is the only thing that pays. The only thing that lets you keep moving. The only thing that, for all its pain, gives you a purpose. However dark, however fleeting. For others, it's inertia. You've been doing it so long, you don't know what else you could do. You wouldn't even know where to begin. A normal life feels like fiction, like something you once saw from a distance, but never touched. And for a few, though not many, there is a strange kind of pride, not in the killing, but in the surviving. In the fact that, despite it all, you're still here, still breathing, still out of reach. But even that pride is quiet. It never speaks loudly. It never asks to be seen. Because the assassin's life is not about being known. It's about not being known. It's about disappearing before the curtain rises. It's about being a ghost in a world that punishes the living far more than the dead. And so, night after night, you walk the streets with your head down, your footsteps light, your mind scanning every window, every corner, every sudden noise. And you wonder, not if someone is watching, but how many people are watching. How many have figured you out? How many are waiting for you to slip, to fall, to falter? The truth is, no one can live like this forever. Eventually, fear becomes too loud, the shadows too thick, the silence too deep. Some assassins disappear because they choose to. They walk away, if they can. Others disappear because the world catches up with them, because someone talked, or someone followed, or someone else was just better at hiding. And some simply fade, not remembered, not missed, just gone. And in their place, the world carries on, unaware that someone once stood there, trembling under the weight of everything they'd done, and everything they feared was still to come. The assassin's tools, not gadgets, just scraps. If you listen to the stories or watch the films, you'd think the assassin's toolkit was something close to magic. Hidden blades that flick out silently, poison powders stored in elegant glass vials, grappling hooks, smoke bombs, secret compartments in boots. It all sounds thrilling, efficient, clever. But the real medieval assassin didn't have any of those things. They had scraps. They had what they could afford, which often wasn't much. They had what they could find, steal, or build with their own hands using tools that were never meant for what they were about to do. There were no tailors designing special cloaks, no metal workers crafting compact weapons, no hidden laboratories with bubbling flasks and secret formulas. There was no research and development. There was no budget. There was only survival. So the tools they carried were never elegant, never beautiful. They were blunt, heavy, awkward. They had to be used in ways they were never meant to be used. And they had to be hidden, always, even when you didn't feel safe without them. A knife was the most common choice, of course, but not a good knife. Not a soldier's blade. Not a sleek dagger. Most assassins used kitchen knives, carving blades, old farming tools reshaped with a grinding stone if they were lucky enough to have one, or with a river rock if they weren't. Blades were carried not in leather sheaths, but in cloth wraps, tucked under belts, stuffed inside worn boots, wedged between the lining of a cloak and a patched shirt. If you had more than one knife, you weren't rich. You were careful. But sometimes a knife wasn't the answer. Sometimes the job called for silence, or discretion, or a longer reach. And so, they used cords. Not ropes, not thick ones, too bulky, too obvious, but thin cords of flax or hemp, sometimes even strips of cloth twisted tight. They weren't strong, they weren't perfect. They wore out quickly and frayed with use, but if wrapped fast and pulled hard enough, they could be deadly, especially if your target was unaware or asleep. That was the key, the element of surprise. Because if the victim fought back, your tool was only as good as your grip, and your grip might not hold. Some assassins used blunt tools, hammers, mallets, small wooden clubs. These were not for clean work. They left blood, bone, noise, but they didn't need much skill, just timing, just strength, just the willingness to swing without hesitating. Poison, when used, was rare and unreliable. Contrary to popular belief, poisons in the medieval period were not the precise instant killers modern fiction describes. They were slow, crude, difficult to acquire. Many of them had only a chance of working, and sometimes that chance was low. You might make someone sick. You might take hours or days to see results. And during that time, everything could go wrong. You needed access to the victim's food, their cup, their breath, and that access was often more difficult than the act of violence itself. Still, some assassins tried. They'd grind herbs, boil roots, mix powders stolen from apothecaries who would never ask questions as long as you paid in coin. But there were risks. The mixture might look strange, smell wrong, be noticed, and if it was traced back to you, death, no trial, no chance. So most stayed away from poison, too risky, too slow. Other tools were even more desperate. Some used fire, a tossed lamp, a dropped ember, a trail of oil. The idea was to cause confusion, to destroy the scene, to cover the evidence. But fire is wild. It doesn't listen. Once released, it answers to no one. Many assassins who tried it never made it out, consumed by the very tool they had trusted. Then there were tools of disguise. Not clever masks, not theatrical costumes, just ordinary clothing that let you pass unnoticed. You didn't want to stand out. You didn't want to look dangerous. You wanted to look tired, poor, unimportant. So you wore what everyone else wore: a hood, a cloak, boots worn flat from walking, hands stained with soot or dirt. If you were lucky, no one would look twice. And in this line of work, being ignored was the greatest tool of all. But tools weren't only physical. Some of the most important tools were habits, behaviors, reflexes, knowing when to move, when to stay still, when to speak, and when to be silent. You learned how to breathe quietly, how to walk without sound, how to open a door without making it creak, how to press your back against a wall and listen to footsteps without panicking. You learned to wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes through the night, because patience was a weapon, and losing it could mean losing everything. You learned how to read people's eyes, how to see fear or suspicion or distraction. And if you were very careful, you learned how to leave no trace. That was the goal, always. Not just to kill, but to disappear. To leave behind only a question, a whisper, a mystery. So no, you didn't carry gadgets. You didn't have the latest tools. You weren't an inventor or a tactician. You were poor, tired, hidden. You carried what you could, used what you must, prayed it would be enough. And when it wasn't, you ran. Because no tool, no matter how sharp or clever, could protect you once the alarm was raised. Once the guards were called, once someone screamed. That was the truth. Your tools only worked as long as no one noticed them. And you, once they did, there was nothing left to help you. No backup, no escape rope, no distraction bomb. Just the same thing you started with: fear, silence, and the hope that you were faster than the people now chasing you. Hunger and silence. Why assassins accepted the job in the first place. It's tempting to believe that everyone has a choice, that people end up in dark places because they were drawn to them, that there was something inside them, twisted or cruel, that pushed them toward violence. It's easier, somehow, to think that way, because if the killer chose to kill, then the rest of us are safe in the knowledge that we would never make that choice. But the truth isn't so clean. Not in the Middle Ages. Not for those who walk the streets with empty hands, hollow eyes, and the weight of nothing left. For many who took the role of assassin, it didn't start with anger, or ideology, or thrill. It started with hunger. The kind of hunger that sits in your bones, that gnaws at your insides, that turns your thoughts soft and strange. Hunger that doesn't go away after a meal because there was no meal and hasn't been one for days. In the medieval world, hunger wasn't rare. It was normal. There were no food banks, no government aid, no social safety nets. If the crops failed, or the markets dried up, or your family died of plague, you simply suffered. And when the suffering became too great, you looked for anything that might give you coin. For most, that meant labor, digging ditches, cleaning stables, working fields not your own. But labor didn't always come with pay, and if it did, it wasn't always enough. A single coin might buy bread, might buy a place to sleep out of the wind, might keep you alive for one more night. So when someone offered that same coin for a different kind of work, quieter, darker work, it didn't feel like a moral dilemma. It felt like an opportunity. A risk, yes, but no greater than the risk of starving, of freezing, of fading from the world with no one to notice. It's hard to explain what it feels like, that kind of desperation. It doesn't scream. It doesn't cry. It hums, low and constant, like a drumbeat under every thought. It makes the world look smaller, choices fewer, the future hazier. And then one night, someone approaches. They don't look dangerous. Or maybe they do. But they speak softly. They have a job, a name, a direction, a coin. That coin gleams in the firelight, or in the moonlight, or in your imagination. It's not a fortune, but it's something. Enough to keep moving, enough to eat, enough to not die today. And that's what most assassins wanted. Not to kill, but to not die. Not from hunger, not from cold, not from being forgotten. So they said yes. And after the first yes, the second was easier. Not because they were becoming comfortable with it, but because they were already marked, already lost in the eyes of society. Once you've killed for coin, even once, there is no going back. You are no longer poor. You are dangerous. You are no longer overlooked. You are feared. You are no longer desperate. You are damned. At least, that's how the world saw you. And so, out of hunger, a pattern began. The first job bought a night's food. The second bought warmth. The third, maybe a bed. Then boots. Then quiet. But not safety, because no matter how many coins you earned, you were never welcome. You couldn't settle. Couldn't be known. Couldn't stay anywhere long. If people began to suspect, if eyes lingered too long, or doors closed when you walked past, you moved on. Because the next town hadn't heard your name. The next town didn't know what you'd done. Yet, there was silence in that too. A silence not just of hiding, but of absence. No friends, no family, no voice to say your name when you were gone. You existed only as a shape, a rumor, a task. And even that, faint as it was bought with blood. So why keep going? Why not stop? Some did try to stop, to leave the work behind. But leaving meant going back to the hunger and the cold and the silence that came not from hiding, but from being invisible. Because being poor was not much safer than being a killer. It just meant you died slower. And there's something cruel in that, in the way society offered no path back, no way to cleanse what you'd done. No chance at redemption. Once a killer, always a killer. Even if all you wanted was to survive. Some tried to forget what they'd done, tried to drink it away, sleep it away, pray it away. But the mind remembers, especially at night, especially in the silence between footsteps. The silence between breaths. The silence when you lie awake, waiting for morning to come. And if the coin runs out, you know what you'll do. You'll wait. You'll listen. You'll look for the next whisper, the next name, because the hunger doesn't care about guilt, or shame, or morality. The hunger only asks one question: what will you do to make it stop? And the assassin, tired and hollow and barely human, will answer in the only way they know how: by saying yes. Shadows in broad daylight, hiding in plain sight. People often imagine assassins as creatures of the night, moving only after sunset, clinging to rooftops, melting into darkness. But in the real world, shadows don't just fall at night. They gather in corners, in crowded streets, in markets filled with noise. In sunlight, the most dangerous assassins didn't hide in the dark. They hid in plain sight. And to do that, they had to become invisible. Not by wearing masks, not by dressing in black, not by creeping along alleyways like some ghost from a myth. No, that would attract attention. In the real medieval world, attention was a threat. Standing out was a risk. The safest assassin was the one no one remembered, the one who looked like everyone else. And so they blended in. They wore what others wore: simple wool tunics, worn leather shoes, cloaks patched at the shoulder, hoods that were common, not dramatic. Their clothes didn't say danger. They said poverty, or labor, or just nothing at all. The key was to never be interesting. Interesting people are remembered. Ordinary ones are not. In a crowded marketplace, an assassin could follow a target for hours without raising suspicion. Not by lurking, but by doing what everyone else was doing: walking slowly, stopping at stalls, pretending to look at fish, or fabric, or fruit. They didn't need to be fast or strong. They just needed to be patient and forgettable. Sometimes they carried tools out in the open: a butcher's knife on the belt, a hammer in hand, a length of rope tied to a pack. Because tools, when seen in context, are harmless. It's not the blade that causes fear. It's the way it's held. So assassins held them like workers, like travelers, like nobodies. And they watched. That was their real skill, not violence, but observation. They watched faces, watched movements, watched patterns. They learned how their target walked, who they spoke to, where they lingered when they were alone. They waited for the right moment. Not a dramatic one, not a perfect one, just a quiet one. A turn down an empty lane, a visit to the edge of a garden, a pause near a door no one watched. And then, maybe they acted, or maybe they didn't. Maybe the moment passed. Maybe they followed again the next day, because rushing was deadly. Mistakes weren't forgiven. Being seen at the wrong time, being recognized, being caught in a place you shouldn't be, these were death sentences. So patience mattered more than speed, and silence mattered more than strength. But silence didn't just mean not talking. It meant moving like the world had nothing to do with you. It meant not reacting when a guard looked your way, not flinching when a dog barked, not showing fear, even when fear was all you felt. The best assassins learned how to carry stillness with them. They didn't move quickly. They moved naturally. If you watch them, you'd see nothing special. And that was exactly the point. In daylight, when the world is alive and full of noise, the safest place to hide is among the noise. in a town square, in a chapel, in a tavern. You don't vanish by running. You vanish by staying. But not for too long, because staying means familiarity. And familiarity is the enemy. Once someone knows your face, you're no longer invisible. So, the assassin moved from town to town, from city to village, from region to region, and each time they became someone new. Not with a costume, not with a disguise, just with silence, with vague answers, with stories that couldn't be checked. They became a traveler, a trader, a shepherd looking for work, a laborer passing through. And no one asked too many questions, because the medieval world was full of people on the move, fleeing famine, escaping war, searching for anything better than what they left behind. And the assassin? They were just one more shadow in the crowd. If someone did ask questions, the assassin gave them nothing. A name, maybe, but only a first name. A town, perhaps, but one far away, one no one knew. And they made sure to give just enough truth to make the lie feel safe. Because trust, once earned, was dangerous. Too much of it, and people got curious. Too little, and people got suspicious. So the assassin walked a narrow path. Known, but not remembered. Seen, but not studied. Always present, never specific. And when the job was done, if it ever was, they were gone. Just like that. No farewell, no final words. Only silence. And maybe a name left behind. Spoken once, briefly, then forgotten. Because the most successful assassins in history were never famous. They were never feared in their time. They were never hunted by name, because no one knew who they were. They weren't shadows at night. They were shadows in broad daylight. And that's what made them truly dangerous. They were ordinary until they weren't. And by the time anyone realized, it was too late, getting caught. What happens when it all falls apart? No one plans to fail. Not really. Even the poorest, most desperate assassin in the medieval world begins each job with some quiet hope that it will go smoothly, that it will end quickly, that the shadows will hold, that no one will see, that escape is possible, that silence will follow. But the truth is, more often than not, things don't go as planned. Because even the best patience, the most careful footsteps, the quietest hands cannot stop the world from shifting unexpectedly. Maybe someone walks around a corner too soon. Maybe a door creaks louder than it should. Maybe the victim struggles more than expected, or screams, or fights. Maybe someone was watching. Maybe a child saw you. Maybe a guard was closer than you realized. And just like that, the job is no longer a job. It's a disaster. It's not silence anymore. It's noise, shouting, running, panic. Getting caught in that world didn't mean being brought in gently. There were no calm arrests, no long investigations. If someone shouted murder in the street, people didn't ask questions. They acted. Crowds formed. Stones flew. Guards stormed in with clubs raised. And you, small, thin, dirty, holding a bloody blade, became the center of it all, the target. If you were lucky, they knocked you out. If you weren't, you were beaten until you couldn't move, until you stopped fighting, until you stopped breathing sometimes, because justice was quick in the streets, and it didn't wait for evidence. But maybe you did survive. Maybe the guards hauled you away. Maybe you were chained, dragged through the streets like an animal, bleeding from the head, your clothes torn, your name screamed by someone you never met. That was only the beginning, because the worst came after. There were no trials in the way we imagine them, no lawyers, no appeals, just accusations, just the word of whoever was loudest, and the word of someone poor, someone who killed for coin, someone with no name, no family, no reputation. That word was worth nothing. They would ask you questions, not kindly, not carefully. They would ask with fists, with boots, with ropes and fire. They would call it justice. They would call it truth-seeking. But it was pain, plain and simple. Because they didn't want facts. They wanted confirmation. They wanted someone to blame. And you, standing there with nothing but a bent knife and an empty stomach, were easy to blame. If you confessed, they'd cheer. They'd nod. They'd say, "See? We were right." If you denied it, they'd hurt you more. And if you refused to speak, they'd invent the answers. Either way, your fate was already sealed. Punishment wasn't delayed. Once the town believed you were guilty, and it didn't take much, they made an example of you. You weren't just punished for the murder. You were punished for what you represented, for the fear you caused, for the reminder that anyone, even someone, standing quietly in the corner of a market could be dangerous. And that terrified them. So they made sure your ending was loud, brutal, public. Some were hanged, slowly, bodies left swinging as a warning. Others were burned, their faces disfigured by smoke before the fire even touched their feet. Others were broken, tied to wheels, or dragged behind carts until there was nothing left but torn skin and silence. And people watched. They always watched. Because in their watching, they found comfort, reassurance, a reminder that the world had rules, and that those who stepped outside them were punished. But the assassin knew better. The assassin knew that the world didn't care about justice. It cared about control, about fear, about keeping things quiet. And the assassin, even in chains, even with their face in the mud, had already lost that fight long before the blade ever left its sheath. And still, what haunts the most is not the pain, not the public ending, not even the betrayal or the loneliness. It's the silence after. Because once you're gone, no one speaks of you. No stories are told. No names are carved. No graves are marked. You vanish. Like smoke. Like nothing. And the world moves on. As if you were never there. No legacy. What history forgets? Everyone, in one way or another, hopes to be remembered. Not with statues, not with songs, but with something. A name passed on. A story told around a fire. A mark made somewhere in the world that says, I was here. I lived. I mattered. But for the medieval assassin, there was no legacy. There was only silence. Their names were not written in chronicles. Their stories were not preserved by poets or monks. They did not appear in the annals of kings or the letters of merchants. They were shadows that passed through towns and vanished before morning, leaving behind little more than rumors and fear. And if they were remembered at all, it was not with kindness. It was not with sympathy. It was with a quiet shake of the head, a muttered word, a story meant to scare children, a lesson in what not to become. Because the world didn't just forget them, it chose to forget them. History, as we know it, was written by men who wore robes and held quills, men who sat in monasteries and courts, who wrote about saints and knights and noble deaths. They wrote about kings and queens and battles and sermons. They didn't write about people in alleyways, about men with broken boots and borrowed knives, about women who waited in silence until a door creaked open, about those who killed not for power or politics, but because someone offered them a coin and they needed to eat. Those stories didn't fit the version of the past they wanted to preserve, and so they were left out. Not because they weren't real, but because they weren't useful. The assassin didn't have a voice. They didn't write their thoughts in parchment journals. They didn't leave behind descendants proud to speak their name. They didn't build churches or fight wars or win lands. They disappeared quietly, almost politely, as if they knew they weren't meant to be remembered. And maybe, in some way, they did know. Because legacy isn't just about being remembered, it's about being seen. And the assassin was never truly seen. They were watched, feared, hunted, used, but not seen. Not for who they were, not for why they did what they did, only for what they could do. And what they could do was end lives, quickly, silently, permanently. So when they vanished, when their final breath slipped into the wind, there was no one to speak for them. No one to say, this person lived a hard life. No one to say, this was someone who tried to survive in a world that gave them nothing. No one to say anything at all. And even now, centuries later, we don't really know their names. We have no list of assassins, no census, no registry of those who lived in the shadows and died without ceremony. We have guesses, hints, a few stories here and there, but those stories are never told from the assassin's side. They are told from the outside, by those who survived, or by those who invented tales to make the world feel neater. The assassin becomes a villain, or a phantom, or a cautionary tale. Rarely do they become human, because to humanize them would be to admit something uncomfortable. That the line between killer and victim isn't always clear. That desperation makes strange decisions feel like survival. That, given the same hunger, the same fear, the same silence, anyone might make the same choice. And that's not a legacy most people want to acknowledge. Alone in a crowd, the assassin's social death. It's a strange thing to feel invisible when you're surrounded by people, to walk through a crowded marketplace, hear laughter and footsteps and voices all around you, and yet feel like none of it touches you, like you're not really there, not really part of it, like you're a shadow pretending to be a person. That was daily life for a medieval assassin. Not just hidden in the physical sense, but erased in a deeper, colder way. A kind of social death, One that happens slowly, quietly, almost politely. At first, you might think it's freedom. No one asking questions, no one bothering you, no one expecting anything. You're just another face in the crowd. You move where you want, sleep where you can, speak only when necessary. And in those early days, that invisibility feels like power. But it doesn't stay that way. Because the more you live without being seen, the more you begin to vanish, even from yourself. You lose the small things first, things you never thought you'd miss. Conversations, laughter, eye contact, the sound of your own name. Then you lose the bigger things. Trust, comfort, identity. You become quiet not just in voice, but in thought. You stop remembering what it felt like to be known, and you're always moving. You can't settle, can't build anything, can't stay anywhere long enough to be noticed, because being noticed means being remembered, and being remembered means being in danger. So you travel, from one town to the next, from one bed of straw to the next. You stop making friends, because friends ask questions. You stop forming habits, because habits leave trails. You stop speaking freely, because someone might hear. Even in a crowd, you're alone. Not because you want to be, but because you have to be. And the people around you, they feel it. Even if they don't know what you are, they know something is off. People sense danger, even when they can't name it. They feel the silence around you, the distance in your eyes, the way you listen more than you talk, the way you always sit with your back to a wall, the way you never drink too much, the way you disappear before the fire goes out. So they stay away. You're not shunned exactly. You're avoided, as if by instinct, as if their bodies know what their minds don't. And in time, you become grateful for that distance, because distance is safe, but it's also heavy, and it grows heavier the longer you carry it. Because being alone is not the same as being safe. Being alone means there's no one to notice when you're hurt, no one to speak your name if you vanish, no one to tell your story if the worst happens in a cold alley or behind a tavern at midnight. It means you don't matter to anyone, and no one matters to you. That kind of loneliness is not dramatic. It doesn't shout. It doesn't cry. It just sits with you all the time, like hunger, like fear, like silence, and sometimes you try to break it. Maybe you sit too long at a table, hoping for a word. Maybe you offer someone a coin just to talk. Maybe you lie about who you are, just for the comfort of pretending you belong. But it never lasts. Because sooner or later, the mask slips. You forget to smile at the right moment. You answer too quickly. You step too quietly, and they feel it again. That chill, that weight, that sense that something about you is wrong. And so the silence returns, and you go back to being alone. Alone in a crowd, alone at a fire, alone in your thoughts, alone in your life. And eventually, you stop trying to change it, because it hurts less if you stop hoping. You tell yourself it's better this way, safer, quieter, simpler, and maybe it is. But it's not living, not really. It's existing. It's moving through the world like smoke, visible only for a moment before fading into the air. And you begin to wonder, after a while, if you're even real anymore, if you were ever real to begin with. Because people need mirrors, we see ourselves in others, in their eyes, in their words, in their laughter. Without that, we start to disappear. Bit by bit, day by day. And the assassin disappears faster than most. Not because they want to, but because the job demands it. Because being seen means being known. And being known means being vulnerable. So they choose the quiet. They choose the shadows. They choose the silence, but the cost is high. It's not paid in gold. It's paid in memory, in identity, in love, in belonging. And in the end, the assassin walks not through the dark, but through the absence of connection, through streets where no one waves, through markets where no one smiles, through lives they can never be part of. Because when you've taken life from others, the world rarely lets you have one of your own. Even if all you ever wanted was to survive, the weight of silence, guilt, memory, and the assassin's conscience. It's easy to imagine silence as peaceful, something calm and still that settles over the world when the noise fades, something that allows rest, reflection, sleep. But for the assassin, silence was not peace. It was weight. It was memory. It was everything that couldn't be said, piling up inside the mind like stones in a sack, slow at first, but heavier with time. At the start, the silence feels necessary. You don't speak of what you've done because you can't. You hide it for survival, for safety, for distance. But eventually, you stop speaking about other things too. You stop telling stories. You stop describing dreams. You stop laughing in the way people do when they feel safe. You begin to carry it all quietly. Not just the facts, but the feelings. Not just what you did, but who you were when you did it. And it stays with you. Not all at once, not loudly, but like a low hum behind every thought. A presence in the mind that never really sleeps. You remember the faces first, sometimes clearly, sometimes in fragments. A glance, a flinch, the way someone's mouth moved just before they understood what was happening. You remember the breath, the stillness, the way sound dropped out of the world for a second after the act. You tell yourself not to, but you do. Even when the job was clean, even when it was fast, even when it was quiet, the memory doesn't go away. It doesn't obey you. It lingers, and sometimes it grows. At night, when the streets are quiet and the fire has gone cold, you think about what you did, not always with regret, but with weight, with presence, with the knowledge that you are still carrying those moments, even if no one else sees them, even if no one else knows. Especially because no one else knows. There is no one to confess to, no one to understand, no one to say, that was wrong, or you had no choice. No one to argue either way. So the only voice is yours. And sometimes that voice is cruel. It asks, why did you do it? It asks, would you do it again? It asks, who have you become? You try not to answer, but the silence always listens. Guilt, for an assassin, is not sharp. It doesn't come all at once. It creeps. It settles. It begins in the background and only becomes clear when it's too late to set it down. And not all assassins felt it. Some blocked it out completely, told themselves stories to keep it away. Stories about justice, about fate, about necessity. But even then, the silence had its own way of breaking through. Through dreams, through pauses, through moments of stillness when the mind drifts before sleep and the faces come back. The worst part wasn't always the act. It was the aftermath. The realization that someone was gone, truly gone, and no one knew why. That no one would ever know who did it or why. That no one would say their name again. And that you were the last person who saw them alive. Sometimes that gave you power. Other times, it made you feel like a grave. Because in killing them, you buried more than a body. You buried a story, a life, a thread in the fabric of the world. And you were left holding the loose end, alone. Some assassins tried to forget, tried to drink it away, tried to run, tried to kill more, thinking maybe the weight would balance if there were enough names, enough coins, enough silence. But it didn't. Because memory doesn't fade just because you want it to. And guilt doesn't care about reasons. It only cares about the echo. And the echo comes when the world is quiet. When you lie still. When you think the night will pass uneventfully. And it doesn't. Because memory doesn't sleep. And neither do you. Not truly. And even if you don't feel guilt, you feel something. A tightness. A dull pressure. A question you don't want to ask, but keep carrying anyway. And that question lives in silence. It waits. It grows. It becomes part of you. Not as punishment, but as shadow. And you carry it day after day, year after year. Not because you're haunted, but because you remember. And in remembering, you remain human. Even when the world insists you are not. Even when the silence says you're less. Even when the act says you don't deserve anything more. You remember. And that is the heaviest burden of all. A death without honor. How assassins died and were buried. Every life comes to an end eventually. But the way a life ends says much about how it was lived, and whether or not the world chooses to remember it. Some people are mourned with weeping, with prayers, with solemn processions, their names carried by family, their stories repeated for generations. Others are buried quietly, with few words and fewer witnesses. But the assassin, especially in the medieval world, didn't receive even that. Their death, like their life, came alone, unwitnessed, unwanted, and above all, unspoken. To die without honor was not an accident for the assassin. It was a certainty. Whether killed in the act, executed in public, or found frozen and nameless on the edge of a winter field, the end came not with fanfare, but with absence. There were no funerals for men who killed for coin. No bells rang. No priests were summoned. No mourners gathered, because there was no one to mourn them, and no one willing to stand beside them in death, lest they be tainted by association. Many died as they lived, hunted, cornered, bleeding in alleyways or fields, cold wind cutting through their final breaths, their last thoughts likely filled with fear, not peace. Others were captured, dragged through dirt-caked streets while townsfolk gathered to curse them, spit on them, or strike them as they passed. There was no presumption of innocence, no fair trial, and certainly no mercy. A whispered accusation was enough. A suspicious look, a recognized face, a slip of the tongue, and it could all unravel. Execution was not carried out behind closed doors. It was a spectacle, performed for the crowd. Hanging, burning, dismemberment. Each method carefully chosen to remind the people of one simple message: that this life, this person, this crime would not be tolerated. The assassin, whose entire career depended on remaining unseen, now stood at the center of attention. Their final moments stolen from them by the jeering of strangers and the pounding of iron against wood. And yet, even in death, they were not truly known. There was no one to tell their story, no one to explain what led them to this point. The town knew what the crowd said, not what the killer thought. The world saw only a shadow, not the person inside it. And once the body fell still, it was discarded with the same coldness that had defined their life. If buried at all, it was done hastily, in unmarked ground, usually beyond the town's borders, far from the graveyards reserved for souls deemed worthy of rest. The church refused to grant burial rites to murderers. Without absolution, without last rites, without a name spoken over the grave, the assassin's body became not a symbol of regret or caution, but simply a thing to remove. No stone was carved. No cross was raised. Their grave, if one existed, was shallow, dug quickly, filled with frozen earth, and forgotten within days. But not all died publicly. Some died during the job itself, mid-motion, mid-step, their last breath taken not in a crowd, but alone in the dark. Perhaps the victim fought back. Perhaps a guard arrived too soon. Perhaps the assassin slipped. One wrong move was all it took. A stumble on cobblestones, a knife too dull, a cry too loud. Their death would be swift, but not clean, and almost never noticed until long after the body had cooled. Others died far from their work, not by violence, but by neglect. They died of fever, of starvation, of exposure to the elements, sleeping in barns, abandoned huts, or under trees when shelter could not be found. No one recognized them. No one asked questions. Their death was not recorded because their life had never been registered in the first place. They passed into the dirt like leaves in autumn, without ceremony, without witness, and without a single soul to say, "I knew them." And perhaps that was the greatest tragedy. Not the act of dying itself, but the fact that when they died, it was as if they had never been alive at all, because the assassin, by design or by necessity, lived outside the structures that make a life visible. They had no family to claim them, no community to stand with them, no records, no children, no history. Their job required silence, and that silence extended past their last breath. There was no legacy, because the life they lived could not afford one. And even if someone had known them, few would dare speak their name after death, for fear of being seen as sympathetic or complicit. Sometimes, even the person who hired them ensured they would be forgotten. A dead assassin could not speak, could not reveal a deal, could not demand the rest of their payment. In some cases, clients arranged for the assassin's death from the very beginning, hiring them only to eliminate them once the task was done. A second knife in the dark, a shadow on the rooftops, and then nothing. 2 bodies instead of 1, and no questions asked. It's easy to imagine that in time, someone would remember them, that a name might survive, a story might linger, that some trace would endure. But the truth is, history did not remember assassins, not the real ones. It invented new ones instead, more interesting, more skilled, more stylish. The real assassins, with their dirty boots, trembling hands, and empty bellies, were replaced by characters in poems and plays, romanticized to the point of fiction. And so, even their deaths were stolen from them. The truth of it lost beneath layers of myth. The silence of their real story buried deeper than the body. And while the world loves to remember kings and knights, poets and martyrs, it rarely finds space to remember those who died alone in the dirt, unblessed and unnamed. But they were there. They walked the same streets, slept under the same skies, knew the same fears. They were not heroes, but they were human, and their lives, though quiet and short and often painful, were still lives. Lives that mattered, even if only for a moment, even if only to them, even if no one else will ever speak their name, a name in the dirt. Why no one remembered their faces. In the crowded markets of medieval towns, faces passed by one another without meaning. People came and went, and most were forgotten before they even left the street. The man selling onions, the woman carrying firewood, the boy running barefoot between carts. Their faces blurred into the rhythm of daily life, noticed only when they broke the pattern. The assassin knew this. They depended on it. To kill in a world without records, you didn't need magic. You just needed to be unremarkable. You needed to be the sort of person people forgot while they were still looking at you. And so, they became that person. Not invisible in the supernatural sense, but in the way that draws no memory, no questions, no second glance. They wore what others wore. Faded browns and grays, clothes that looked tired but not torn, a hood that hid the hair, but not in a dramatic way, boots that made no statement, nothing sharp, nothing loud, nothing that stuck in the mind. Their face held no expression. Their voice was low and flat. Their walk unhurried. Their presence a quiet suggestion rather than a declaration. And when the job was done, they left. Quickly, quietly, without thanks, without notice. People remembered actions. They remembered blood, screams, the sound of boots running through the dark, but they rarely remembered the person behind it. He had a beard, maybe, they'd say. Her eyes were dark, or maybe light. He wore a hood. She moved like she didn't want to be seen. None of it helped, because it was by design. The assassins studied how to become forgettable, not just unseen, but unmemorable. They avoided patterns. They never visited the same place twice. They kept their stories short and their stays shorter. If asked where they came from, they picked a town no one could find. If asked their name, they gave a false one, spoken plainly, without charm or confidence. They gave people nothing to hold on to because they knew how memory worked. People remember what surprises them, what makes them feel, what stands out. The assassin avoided all of that. They made their face into a shadow of a face, their voice into background noise, their presence into absence. And it worked, but over time, it changed them. At first, it was a mask, a tool, something worn for survival. But eventually, the mask sank deeper. It became their skin. Their silence became habit. Their avoidance became reflex. Their lies became routine. And soon, they forgot the sound of their real name. They forgot how to speak without watching their words. They forgot what it meant to be seen and not hunted. They stopped knowing what their own face looked like, not just because mirrors were rare, but because there was no need to look. There was nothing in that reflection they needed to remember. Their face wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to the next lie, the next escape, the next job. And when they died, as all assassins eventually did, that forgotten face vanished without resistance. There were no portraits, no coins stamped with their image, no sketches, no surviving descriptions. Their killers, or those who found their bodies, saw nothing worth recording. Just another drifter, they'd say, some stranger, no name. They were buried quickly, if at all, wrapped in their own cloak, dropped into a hole dug behind a wall in soil no one visited. No marker was left, no prayer was spoken, no one wept. There was no one to weep. And if days later someone asked, "Who was that?" the answer came softly, carelessly, with a shrug. No one. Just another name in the dirt. If a name was ever given at all. When the job fails, what happens when you miss? Every assassin, no matter how careful, lives with one simple truth. Failure is always possible. You can study a pattern for days, watch a target from dusk to dawn, plan every step, measure every breath, but none of it guarantees success. Because people are unpredictable. Doors don't open when they're supposed to. Dogs bark. Lights flicker. Someone steps outside at the wrong time. A guard decides to turn left instead of right. And just like that, everything unravels. The moment of failure is quiet at first. A stumble, a hesitation, a blade caught in cloth, a sound you didn't expect, and then noise, then panic, then the world rushing in all at once. You don't get a second try. There is no round two. When the job fails, you run or you die. And if you run, it has to be now, without thinking, without regret, without looking back. But escape doesn't mean safety. If the target lives, they speak. If someone sees your face, they describe it. If you leave a trace, it spreads. The job doesn't just fail, it stains everything after. Towns close to you. Doors lock. Eyes follow. Guards grow suspicious. You go from invisible to hunted in a single night. One mistake, and the silence that once protected you now turns into isolation, suspicion, danger. And the client, the one who gave you the name and the coin, doesn't wait to hear your side. If they even still exist, they vanish first. They might even turn you in, blame you, act like they never knew your face. Because no one wants to be tied to failure, least of all the person who paid for success. You become a liability, a loose thread that must be cut before the fabric tears. Sometimes you're lucky. You run fast enough. You find shelter. You disappear before anyone can follow. But even then, the weight of the job follows you. Not because of guilt, though that's always there, but because failure leaves a scar, not on the body, but on the reputation. What little of it you had, you hesitate more, you trust less, you speak even quieter than before, and the next job, if it comes, is harder. You second guess. You remember the sound of the moment when everything went wrong. And then there's fear. Not the fear of being caught. That's always there. But the deeper fear, the fear of being seen as weak, of being remembered not for what you did, but for what you didn't do. You live in the shadow of the missed chance. It follows you from town to town, even if no one else knows. Because you know, you remember, every time you touch the blade, every time you enter a new room, every time you wait in silence. Failure doesn't end with the job. It lives on in the assassin, in the breath that never steadies, in the eyes that never meet others, in the name that was never earned and now can never be reclaimed. It turns you into something colder, not tougher, just emptier. And the worst failures aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet ones. The jobs you walk away from. The ones where you couldn't finish. Where your hand shook. Where your heart jumped at the last second and told you to stop. Maybe it saved your life. Maybe it spared someone else's, but it also marked you. Because in your world, mercy is not virtue. It's weakness. And weakness is remembered, even in silence. So you move on. You disappear again. But something has changed. You're not the same shadow. You're a shadow that flinches now. A shadow that thinks too much. A shadow that knows it can fail. And once you know that, truly know it, you never move the same way again. Why no one trusted them? The assassin is outcast. In the medieval world, trust was a rare and precious thing. It wasn't given freely. It wasn't offered lightly. It was earned slowly, carefully, often over years, and it could be broken in seconds. People trusted those they worked beside, those they prayed with, those they shared bread with around a fire. Trust was not just about knowing someone. It was about being able to predict them, to expect that they would act in ways you understood, and for reasons that made sense. The assassin never offered that kind of predictability, and because of that, no one trusted them. Even when they hadn't done anything, yet. Even when they walked into a town quietly, paid for a room, spoke only when spoken to, and kept to themselves, people felt something was off. They might not know the reason, but they could feel it, just beneath the surface. A tension in the shoulders, a silence too measured, eyes that scanned more than they needed to, movements too calm to be natural. The assassin didn't move like a farmer, or a laborer, or a merchant. They moved like someone always calculating, always waiting. And people noticed, even if they didn't say it aloud. They closed doors a little quicker, watched from windows, whispered when the stranger passed. Some didn't know why they were afraid. Others didn't need a reason. Instinct was enough. A shadow that didn't feel right. A story they'd heard in another town. A body that turned up 2 weeks after someone who looked just like this passed through. And so the assassin, even when not actively working, even when simply trying to survive, remained on the outside. Not because they wanted to be, but because the world refused to let them in. Trust isn't just about safety. It's about belonging. And the assassin never belonged. They couldn't afford to. To belong meant being known. And being known meant being vulnerable. So even before anyone had reason to suspect them, they were already a stranger. They had no family in town, no friends, no history. Nothing to explain why they were there. Just a name they borrowed, a coin they kept hidden, a blade they never showed unless they had to. And so the people kept their distance. They didn't ask questions, but they didn't offer answers either. If the assassin was injured, no one brought water. If they were cold, no one offered fire. If they were hungry, they paid like anyone else, or went without. The town didn't owe them anything, and more importantly, it didn't want to, because to offer kindness to someone like that felt dangerous. What if the stranger turned out to be what people feared? What if their kindness was repaid with blood? What if tomorrow someone was found dead in a stable, and the only new face in town had been yours? No one wanted that kind of guilt. No one wanted that risk, so it was easier to keep them at a distance. Safer, even if it was cruel. And so the assassin learned not to ask, learned not to hope, learned to expect that every door would close, every hand would pull back, every smile would fade. They stopped trying to be liked, stopped trying to explain, stopped telling stories, because no one believed them anyway. And eventually, they stopped speaking entirely unless they had to. Because silence, at least, couldn't be twisted. But being an outcast doesn't just mean being alone. It means being visible only as a threat. People didn't just ignore the assassin. They watched them. Closely, suspiciously, waiting for something to confirm what they already believed. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, one word spoken too late, and the crowd would turn. And once that happened, there was no return. Because when you're already feared, all it takes is a whisper to become hunted. He looked at me strange. She asked too many questions. He was in the wrong part of town. She walked through the market without buying anything. Nothing criminal, nothing unusual, but enough to stir doubt. Enough to make someone say, "We should watch them." And once someone said that, others followed. Because fear spreads faster than truth. And in the medieval world, with no records, no proof, no protection from the law, a rumor could be as deadly as a blade, sometimes worse. Because a blade kills quickly. A rumor kills slowly. It cuts your ties, one by one, until you have no place to go, no one to turn to, no one to speak your name except in fear. And once that happens, the job is nearly impossible. You can't work when you're being watched. You can't move when every step is followed. You can't survive when every town turns its back. And so the assassin moved faster, stayed shorter, spoke less, trusted no one, because they knew the world had already judged them, not for what they'd done, but for what they could do, for what they might do. And that judgment stuck like mud. Even when washed away, it left a stain. So they stopped trying to prove anything, stopped trying to be anything more than a shadow. Because the truth was, even other criminals didn't trust them. Thieves might work together. Smugglers might share a plan. Bandits might laugh around a fire. But an assassin made everyone nervous. Because they killed for coin, not out of anger, not out of loyalty, just for payment. And if you'd kill one person for coin, why not another? Why not someone sitting next to you? Why not the man who paid you last week? Why not anyone? So even in the underworld, the assassin stood apart, tolerated, but not welcomed, feared, but never embraced. And in that fear, trust vanished completely. Because trust requires predictability. And the assassin was never predictable. Not because they were wild, but because they were quiet, unknowable, careful, detached. And nothing is harder to trust than someone who feels like they've already disappeared. And maybe that's the most painful part, that even in moments when they tried to be honest, when they offered truth, when they dropped the mask just slightly, no one believed them. Because no one could imagine that someone like them could still be human, could still want connection, could still need kindness. The world had already made up its mind, and the assassin learned to stop fighting it, to accept the role, to become the outcast everyone expected. Not because they wanted it, but because it was the only way left to survive, and so they walked alone, slept alone, ate alone, and died alone. Not just in body, but in memory. Because to the world, they were never one of us. They were always something else. Always a warning. Never a neighbor, never a friend, never someone to trust. Only someone to forget. Fear is a habit. Living with paranoia. Fear doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it drips in slowly, one cold drop at a time. It doesn't roar. It whispers. It doesn't strike. It lingers. And before you know it, it's everywhere. You don't notice it at first. You think you're just being careful. You think you're just paying attention, watching the door, listening for footsteps, checking the weight of your blade, keeping your back to a wall. But after a while, it's no longer a choice. It becomes routine, a pattern, a reflex, something you do without thinking, something that shapes how you breathe, how you move, how you sleep, how you wake. For the assassin, fear becomes a habit, not an emotion, not a reaction, but a way of being. It begins on the first time you kill. Not during the act, not in the moment. That moment is full of focus. Your hands know what to do. Your mind is sharp. The world shrinks to a single point. But afterwards, when it's done, when the silence falls and the blood is cooling, that's when it starts. You listen. You wait. You wonder if someone saw, if someone followed, if someone recognized you. You clean the blade, you change your clothes, you slip away, you tell yourself it's over. But your body doesn't believe you. Your heartbeat stays high, your ears stay open, your eyes keep scanning. Even when the danger is gone, you don't relax. You don't exhale. You just keep moving. And then you do it again. Another job, another night, another exit, and the fear stays. At first, it feels sharp, like a blade in your gut. But over time, it softens, it spreads, it settles into your muscles, into your bones. It becomes part of your steps, your posture, your breath. You check every doorway twice. You sleep with your back against stone. You carry 2 knives, not 1. You never drink too much. Never talk too long. You learn the sound of every door hinge, every street dog, every guard's boots. You memorize the rhythm of a town in case it ever changes. You learn to walk without making sound, to breathe without drawing notice. You learn how to feel when someone's watching you, how to sense when something's wrong, even if you can't explain it. You're not scared exactly, not like people think. You don't freeze, you don't scream, you don't run without reason. You're beyond that. The fear is always there, but it's buried now, quiet, constant, like hunger, like gravity. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because fear no longer needs a trigger. You wake up, and it's already waiting. You walk into a new town, and it follows you. You see a group of men laughing by a tavern door, and you feel your fingers twitch. Your eyes scan for exits, even if they haven't looked at you yet. You stop trusting peace, because peace feels like a trap. When the world is quiet, you expect a sound. When the street is empty, you expect a figure to appear. When the crowd is loud, you expect one voice to cut through. You expect danger, always. And that expectation rewires you. You stop relaxing, even when you're alone. You stop sleeping deeply. You stop trusting sleep at all. You learn to wake at the smallest sound. A shift in the wind, a creak in the beams, a drop of rain that wasn't falling a moment ago. Your dreams become short, shallow, scattered. Sometimes they're filled with voices. Sometimes with silence. Sometimes with nothing but footsteps following yours through a street that never ends. And during the day, the fear becomes a lens. You see things differently. A man who looks too long becomes a threat. A cart that turns the wrong corner becomes a tale. A child who asks too many questions might be listening for someone else. Even kindness makes you pause. Because kindness could be a trick, an opening that leads to a blade, a drink that leads to a question, a smile that hides a test. So you decline the drink. You avoid the fire. You leave before the song begins. You say no before anyone asks. And people notice. They feel the distance in you, the way you don't linger, the way you don't laugh, the way you don't look anyone in the eye for more than a second. They call it coldness, or arrogance, or danger. They're not wrong, but they don't understand the reason. The reason is fear. Not just fear of being caught, not just fear of being betrayed, but fear of being known, because to be known is to be exposed. And exposure is a death sentence. So you wear the mask, not to lie, but to survive. And the longer you wear it, the harder it is to take off, even when no one is watching. Even when you're alone, even when the danger is gone, you still flinch, still check, still doubt, because fear doesn't let go. It becomes a shape inside you. It becomes your shadow. And the strange thing is, you start to miss it when it's not there. You feel restless without it, unstable, exposed, like walking through open space with no blade in hand, like standing in a crowd without a wall behind you. You don't know how to live without fear anymore, because it's been your companion longer than anyone else. It taught you to stay alive. It kept you moving. It gave you instinct when logic failed. It warned you when silence became too deep. It saved you again and again. And now you don't know where you end and it begins. You wonder sometimes what it would be like to live without it, to walk slowly, to speak freely, to sleep through the night, to forget to check every corner before entering a room. But that wonder never lasts, because the world you live in doesn't allow forgetting. It punishes those who let their guard down. It waits for you to blink. And you've seen what happens when others do. You've seen the ones who got too comfortable, the ones who stayed too long in one town, the ones who believed they were safe. You saw their faces when the door broke open. You saw the blood. You saw the regret, and you never forgot. Because fear teaches through memory. It teaches through repetition. And its lessons leave scars. Scars you don't show. Scars you don't explain. Scars that change how you breathe, how you think, how you move through the world. So you keep moving. You keep watching. You keep the blade close. You listen for danger, even when no one is near. You wait for betrayal, even when no one has spoken. And in the quiet moments, you don't relax. You prepare. Because fear has become habit, and habit has become identity, and identity has become survival. Nothing left behind. The legacy that never was. In the end, there was nothing. No name carved into stone. No tale passed down by family. No song sung in dark taverns. Just silence, and then forgetfulness. The assassin who moved through cities like smoke and vanished just as easily, left no trail that time wanted to follow. Their legacy was not just missing, it was never permitted to exist. In a world where legacy came from lineage, loyalty, or letters, the assassin had none of those things. No children to carry their name. No homeland to mourn their passing. No scrolls to record their deeds. Even their clients, those who paid for blood, erased them the moment the coin changed hands. You can build a legacy with words, but the assassin avoided words whenever possible. You can build a legacy with honor, but they worked in shadows, where honor was considered a liability. You can build a legacy through reputation, but even reputation needs witnesses, and the assassin never left anyone alive who could describe their face. They were anonymous by design, but anonymity, for all its safety, is a poor foundation for memory. And even if someone had wanted to remember them, there was nothing to hold on to. No relic, no keepsake, no face, no name. Just an echo, dull and fading, heard only by those who were already looking for it. Townsfolk didn't pass stories about assassins with the same reverence they did for soldiers or saints. They didn't hang their portraits or tell children, "Be like them." If the assassin appeared in a tale, it was as a warning, a phantom, a footnote, not as a person, not as someone who lived and struggled and hoped, just as danger with a heartbeat. They didn't get buried in holy ground. They weren't granted prayers. The few who spoke of them after death did so with caution or contempt, never affection. And without affection, legacy cannot survive. Because a legacy is not made from fact alone. It is built from care, from love, from the stubborn desire to remember someone, even when the world says not to. And no one loved the assassin, not in that way. Maybe once, long ago. Before the blade, before the silence. But that love didn't last. It couldn't. The life they chose, or the life that chose them, devoured everything that might have endured, including the people who once saw them as more than what they became. So, they died, and the world went on. The town didn't pause. The sky didn't darken. No statue was raised. No grave was marked. No story lingered. There was no weeping. No one lit candles. No one whispered their name in quiet moments of memory. No one traced the place where they fell with reverence or guilt. If anything, their absence was a relief, a danger removed, a problem solved, and in the rare cases when someone did remember them, it was out of fear, not grief. But fear doesn't preserve legacy. It distorts it. Fear turns a person into a myth, and myth into something unreal, something exaggerated, something hollow. Over time, what little remained of the assassin story became less about who they were and more about what people imagined them to be. They became a ghost in the rafters, a rumor told in warnings, a shadow used to frighten children. Their truth, whatever it had been, was lost beneath layers of fiction. And fiction, though it lasts, is never loyal. And perhaps the assassin knew this. Perhaps they accepted that they would leave no trace, that their work, by its very nature, meant being forgotten. They weren't martyrs. They weren't poets. They didn't fight for kings or defend borders or build cathedrals. They weren't part of anything that history thought worth preserving, and over time, they stopped hoping for more. They stopped saving objects, stopped telling anyone their real name, stopped expecting that anyone, anywhere, would try to remember them. But the absence still stung, even in silence, even in shadows, even in lives ruled by fear. Some part of the assassin still longed for something to outlast them. A word, a mark, a sign that they had existed, that their footsteps had touched this earth, that their choices had meant something. Because every life, even the quietest, wants to be known, wants to be remembered, wants to matter. And yet, when death came, it brought only stillness, no reckoning, no redemption, no record. The assassin became what they had always feared and always expected: no one. Not because they lacked value, but because the world decided not to see it. Their story was not convenient, not glorious, not useful, and so it was erased, one forgotten breath at a time. They didn't vanish in fire or thunder. They simply weren't there anymore. A room that used to be occupied, a bed that stayed cold, a name that stopped being spoken. And slowly, the world filled in the space they left, as if they had never been part of it to begin with. Time didn't fight to keep their memory alive. Time was glad to let it go. Some legacies are heavy, others are bright. The assassin left nothing behind, not even a shadow the world wanted to keep. And in a strange, quiet way, that was their legacy. Not absence, but erasure. Not memory, but blankness. The legacy of being unwanted, unnoticed, unmarked. A life written in air and wiped away by wind. And yet, here we are, speaking of them, even now. Which means they weren't erased completely. Not yet. Not entirely. Chapter 21. Sleep Comes Slow. How Assassins Tried to Rest. Sleep didn't come easily. Not for them. Not after what they'd done. Not after what they expected might still come. Even when the room was warm, even when the night was quiet, even when the job was finished and the door was bolted, sleep waited too long to arrive. And when it did, it arrived in fragments, never whole, never kind, never without weight. It started with the body refusing to settle. You'd lie down, eyes open, staring at wood beams or a cracked ceiling, listening to wind outside, counting the distance between each gust. You'd shift, once, twice, then again. You'd listen for footsteps that never came, for sounds that didn't exist. A creak, a cough, a change in the silence, anything. You'd hold your breath and wait. And if nothing happened, you'd exhale, slowly, like something inside you still didn't trust the air. Even the act of closing your eyes was something to work at. Because closing your eyes meant letting go. It meant trusting that the world wouldn't turn against you while you rested. And trust, as always, was hard to come by. Not because you expected someone in particular to break in, but because experience had taught you that danger didn't need a reason. It only needed time, and time was always passing. When sleep finally came, it wasn't soft. It was thin, stretched across the hours like gauze. You didn't sink into it. You floated above it. You dipped in and out. You woke suddenly, not knowing why. You turned your head toward shadows that hadn't moved. You listened again. You checked the door. You checked the knife. Then you lay back down, heartbeat loud against your ribs, and tried once more. Some nights you dreamed, but dreams weren't refuge. They were reminders. Faces you'd forgotten returned in broken flashes. Rooms you'd escaped twisted into dead ends. Voices called out, not in anger, but in confusion. They asked questions you didn't want to hear. They reached for you. You pulled away. You woke with your hand clenched around the empty air. And even when the dreams were quiet, they weren't peaceful. They carried the same weight as the day, the same edge, the same doubt. You dreamed of places you'd never been, of roads that looped endlessly, of houses that didn't exist, and through all of it ran a thread of unease, familiar, quiet, unshakable. So, you stopped expecting sleep to restore anything. You slept to survive, not to rest. You took what hours you could. A nap in a stable, a moment beneath trees, a seat by a dying fire. You kept your boots on. You never let your back face the room. You learned to sleep in half-light, in noise, in places where rest wasn't made for you. And people noticed. They saw it in your eyes, in the way you blinked too slowly, in the way you sat with your shoulders tense, even when nothing threatened you, in the way you seemed always halfway between waking and leaving. They didn't understand it. They thought it was part of your trade, some kind of discipline, a choice. But it wasn't a choice. It was exhaustion. Not from lack of sleep, but from years of never truly feeling safe. From nights that taught you not to let go. From mornings that started too early. After nights that never really ended. It was the exhaustion of someone who never got to lie down fully. Who never felt the weight of a blanket without also feeling the weight of a blade. And still, you kept going. You learned to function without rest. You trained your hands to stay steady even when your thoughts wandered. You trained your eyes to find light even when the world swam in fatigue. You made your life out of brief moments. 2 hours here, 1 hour there, stacked on top of each other until your bones ached and your mind frayed at the edges. Eventually, sleep stopped feeling like something you missed. It became something you feared. Because in sleep, you were vulnerable. In sleep, your past caught up. In sleep, there were no walls, no blades, no escape, only memory. And sometimes, that was worse than any enemy. There were days when your body begged for sleep, when your legs shook and your head swam and your fingers fumbled, but you stayed awake anyway. You drank bitter herbs, you chewed roots, you walked through the cold air just to keep your thoughts sharp. You pressed your palms to stone walls to feel something solid. You recited names just to remind yourself that you were still here. And when you did give in, when your body forced you to stop, it came like collapse. You didn't drift into sleep. You fell into it, hard, all at once. And when you woke, it was with confusion, with a gasp, with muscles stiff and eyes dry. You didn't know how long you'd been out. You didn't know if anyone had passed through the room. You just knew you had woken, and now you had to move. Some assassins tried to create rituals around rest, a way to trick the body into believing it was safe. They arranged stones at the door. They placed bells near windows. They buried blades under the pillow. Some whispered old prayers, not because they believed, but because rhythm sometimes calmed the mind. Others used wine, or smoke, or worse, anything to dull the edge, anything to force stillness. But none of it lasted, because deep down, they knew the truth. Sleep was not safety. Sleep was the pause between jobs, between dangers, between all the things that might go wrong. And as long as they lived in that space, between shadow and silence, true rest would never come. And so they adapted. They became people who lived tired, who moved through the world without softness, who didn't yawn, who didn't stretch, who didn't sink into beds or linger in blankets. They curled up in corners. They leaned against stone. They disappeared into the edges of rooms. They made their home in discomfort. And when someone asked, if anyone ever did, "Don't you sleep?" they would say, "Sometimes," and leave it at that. Because how could you explain the way fear seeped into your dreams? How could you describe what it was like to be alone, even in sleep? How could you admit that your body had forgotten what peace felt like? You couldn't. So you just kept moving. And sleep kept coming slowly, always late, always thin, always just enough to keep you alive, never enough to make you feel whole. Sleep comes slow, how assassins tried to rest. Sleep didn't come easily, not for them, not after what they'd done, not after what they expected might still come. Even when the room was warm, even when the night was quiet, even when the job was finished and the door was bolted, sleep waited too long to arrive. And when it did, it arrived in fragments. Never whole, never kind, never without weight. It started with the body refusing to settle. You'd lie down, eyes open, staring at wood beams or a cracked ceiling, listening to wind outside, counting the distance between each gust. You'd shift, once, twice, then again. You'd listen for footsteps that never came, for sounds that didn't exist. A creak, a cough, a change in the silence. Anything. You'd hold your breath and wait. And if nothing happened, you'd exhale, slowly, like something inside you still didn't trust the air. Even the act of closing your eyes was something to work at. Because closing your eyes meant letting go. It meant trusting that the world wouldn't turn against you while you rested. And trust, as always, was hard to come by. Not because you expected someone in particular to break in, but because experience had taught you that danger didn't need a reason. It only needed time. And time was always passing. When sleep finally came, it wasn't soft. It was thin, stretched across the hours like gauze. You didn't sink into it. You floated above it. You dipped in and out. You woke suddenly, not knowing why. You turned your head toward shadows that hadn't moved. You listened again. You checked the door. You checked the knife. Then you lay back down, heartbeat loud against your ribs, and tried once more. Some nights, you dreamed. But dreams weren't refuge. They were reminders. Faces you'd forgotten returned in broken flashes. Rooms you'd escaped twisted into dead ends. Voices called out, not in anger, but in confusion. They asked questions you didn't want to hear. They reached for you. You pulled away. You woke with your hand clenched around the empty air. And even when the dreams were quiet, they weren't peaceful. They carried the same weight as the day, the same edge, the same doubt. You dreamed of places you'd never been, of roads that looped endlessly, of houses that didn't exist. And through all of it ran a thread of unease, familiar, quiet, unshakable. So you stopped expecting sleep to restore anything. You slept to survive, not to rest. You took what hours you could. A nap in a stable, a moment beneath trees, a seat by a dying fire. You kept your boots on. You never let your back face the room. You learned to sleep in half light, in noise, in places where rest wasn't made for you. And people noticed. They saw it in your eyes, in the way you blinked too slowly, in the way you sat with your shoulders tense, even when nothing threatened you, in the way you seemed always halfway between waking and leaving. They didn't understand it. They thought it was part of your trade, some kind of discipline, a choice. But it wasn't a choice. It was exhaustion. Not from lack of sleep, but from years of never truly feeling safe. From nights that taught you not to let go. From mornings that started too early, after nights that never really ended. It was the exhaustion of someone who never got to lie down fully, who never felt the weight of a blanket without also feeling the weight of a blade. And still, you kept going. You learned to function without rest. You trained your hands to stay steady even when your thoughts wandered. You trained your eyes to find light even when the world swam in fatigue. You made your life out of brief moments, 2 hours here, 1 hour there, stacked on top of each other until your bones ached and your mind frayed at the edges. Eventually, sleep stopped feeling like something you missed. It became something you feared. Because in sleep, you were vulnerable. In sleep, your past caught up. In sleep, there were no walls, no blades, no escape, only memory. And sometimes, that was worse than any enemy. There were days when your body begged for sleep, when your legs shook and your head swam and your fingers fumbled, but you stayed awake anyway. You drank bitter herbs. You chewed roots. You walked through the cold air just to keep your thoughts sharp. You pressed your palms to stone walls to feel something solid. You recited names just to remind yourself that you were still here. And when you did give in, when your body forced you to stop, it came like collapse. You didn't drift into sleep. You fell into it, hard, all at once. And when you woke, it was with confusion, with a gasp, with muscles stiff and eyes dry. You didn't know how long you'd been out. You didn't know if anyone had passed through the room. You just knew you had woken. And now you had to move. Some assassins tried to create rituals around rest, a way to trick the body into believing it was safe. They arranged stones at the door. They placed bells near windows. They buried blades under the pillow. Some whispered old prayers, not because they believed, but because rhythm sometimes calmed the mind. Others used wine, or smoke, or worse. Anything to dull the edge, anything to force stillness. But none of it lasted. Because deep down, they knew the truth. Sleep was not safety. Sleep was the pause between jobs, between dangers, between all the things that might go wrong. And as long as they lived in that space, between shadow and silence, true rest would never come. And so they adapted. They became people who lived tired, who moved through the world without softness, who didn't yawn, who didn't stretch, who didn't sink into beds or linger in blankets. They curled up in corners. They leaned against stone. They disappeared into the edges of rooms. They made their home in discomfort. And when someone asked, if anyone ever did, "Don't you sleep?" they would say, "Sometimes," and leave it at that. Because how could you explain the way fear seeped into your dreams? How could you describe what it was like to be alone, even in sleep? How could you admit that your body had forgotten what peace felt like? You couldn't. So you just kept moving, and sleep kept coming slowly, always late, always thin, always just enough to keep you alive, never enough to make you feel whole, the weapon that broke them, tools of the trade and their toll. An assassin's weapon isn't just a tool. It's not just steel or wood or weight. It's memory. It's routine. It's a piece of themselves, carried every day, touched more often than food, closer than clothing. They don't just use it. They live with it. They sleep beside it. They keep it within reach at all times. And because of that, it shapes them, not just in the hand, but in the mind. Blades were the most common, of course. Not the polished kind worn by knights, but short, dull-looking ones that drew little notice. A good assassin didn't need something beautiful. They needed something quiet, slim, fast, easy to hide, easy to throw away. Most carried more than one in the boot, one near the wrist, one behind the belt. You never knew when one would fall, or fail, or stick where it shouldn't. But no matter how many they carried, each had one blade that mattered most, one that felt right, the right weight, the right length, the one they trained with in the dark, the one they tested on branches and strawmen. That blade had a name in their head, even if they never said it out loud. Not a grand name, just a word that meant something. A way to remind themselves that the blade, like them, was alone. Other weapons came and went. Poison was popular, but poison was unreliable. Too slow. Too many unknowns. Some targets had tasters. Others had stomachs like iron. You could spend days preparing the perfect dose, and then watch it fail because the victim skipped dinner, or vomited, or shared their cup with someone else. And even when it worked, poison was never clean. People died slowly, ugly, loud, sometimes screaming, sometimes clawing at the walls. You had to listen, you had to watch, and if you didn't leave fast enough, you had to carry that image forever. Then there were garrots, ropes, wires, cloth, anything that could be used in a quiet corner. No blood, no flash, just silence and wait. But silence was deceptive. Strangling wasn't fast. It took strength. It took patience. It took holding someone down while their body fought to live. Their hands clawed, their heels kicked, their throat tried to scream, but only made choking sounds. Some assassins used this method only once, and never again. Others told themselves it was clean, but clean is not the same as easy, and nothing about that method was easy. Some tried bows, crossbows, slings, but distance created risk. Distance meant you could miss, meant someone else could see, meant someone could follow the arrow back to your hiding place, meant you had to watch your target fall, maybe crawl, maybe shout. And distance meant doubt. Were they truly dead? Did the bolt hit the heart or just the shoulder? Would they stand again once you'd gone? So most went back to the blade. Because with a blade, you knew. You felt it. You saw it. You controlled the moment. And in a world where control was rare, that mattered. But control came at a cost. You had to get close. You had to see the eyes. You had to hear the breath. You had to remember the face. And after enough times, that memory started to follow you. Not the face itself, but the weight, the grip, the echo in your hands. Because the blade doesn't just cut flesh, it cuts into you too. Slowly, quietly, without blood, but not without damage. The wrist stiffens, the fingers cramp, the elbow aches. After years, you start to feel the knife even when it's not in your hand. The phantom of it stays, a pulse in the knuckles, a shadow under the skin. And then there's the other cost, not the physical one, but the way it changes how you see the world. You stop seeing tools for what they are. A fork becomes a dagger, a belt becomes a loop, a brick becomes a weapon. You sit near windows not for light, but for escape. You measure a room by its exits. You watch people's hands more than their eyes. And slowly, you forget how to see anything without suspicion. You carry all these tools, but they start to carry you. They decide how you move, how you pack, how you rest. You think you control them, but after enough years, it's clear you don't. They have shaped your posture, your voice, your smile, or lack of one. And when you try to walk away from the work, the weight stays. Even when you don't draw the blade, your hand reaches for it. Even when you're done with the job, your eyes keep scanning. Even when no threat exists, your shoulders remain tight. You've been wired to act, to react, and the tools you've used for so long are no longer separate from you. Some assassins tried to abandon them. They threw the knives into rivers, buried them under stone, burned the clothing they wore on missions. But it wasn't enough. Because the damage wasn't in the steel. It was in the habits, in the mind, in the memories that never dulled and the body remembered. The scars didn't fade. The stiffness didn't leave. The pain in the hip, in the back, in the neck, it stayed. It reminded them of every rooftop they climbed, every wall they crouched behind, every moment they waited in cold rain for the right breath, the right step, the right time. There was no pension for their kind, no rest, no reward, only the toll. The bill that came due not in coin, but in years stolen from the joints, in voices that didn't laugh, in hands that couldn't stop shaking once the job was done. That was the price of the tools. They broke you slowly, not in battle, but in the waiting, in the repetition, in the carrying. And still, they were used again, because you couldn't work without them, and you couldn't live without work. So you strapped the blade to your thigh. You checked the edge. You said nothing. And you went back into the dark, the lies they told themselves. Every assassin lied, not just to others, but to themselves. It was the only way to keep breathing, to keep moving, to keep the blade steady when it mattered. The lies weren't grand. They weren't dramatic. They were quiet, small. The kind of lie you whisper, not shout. The kind that sits in your mouth like a stone, smooth from use. They started simple. This is just a job. That one came early, taught by someone older, someone who'd already forgotten how to care. You said it before the work. You said it after. You said it while cleaning blood from your hands. It was meant to make things easier, to shrink the meaning, to reduce life to payment. But even as you said it, part of you knew it wasn't true. It was never just a job. It was a person, a choice, a moment you couldn't take back. You knew that, but you lied anyway. Because pretending it was nothing was easier than admitting what you'd done. Then came another lie. They deserved it. Sometimes it felt true. Sometimes the target was cruel. A warlord, a traitor, a man who'd made others suffer, but not always. Some were just inconvenient. Some were innocent. Some were caught in webs they didn't spin, and deep down, you knew that. But saying they deserved it helped you sleep, or, at least, helped you lie still in the dark. If you could believe it, even for a second, the weight lifted, just a little. There was the lie about choice, too. I didn't have a choice. It echoed through cold alleys and colder memories. You told it to yourself when you looked in broken mirrors, when you wrapped bandages, when you counted coins that never seemed to be enough. You told it when the guilt burned too hot. And maybe it was partly true. Maybe you were desperate. Maybe you were alone. Maybe no one offered you another path. But saying you had no choice was still a lie. There was always a choice. You just didn't like what the other one looked like. You lied about the pain. This doesn't hurt me. It did. It always did. But saying that made you weak, so you hid it. You smiled when you needed to. You stayed quiet when it cracked through your ribs. You let your bones ache and your stomach twist. And you told yourself you were fine. You told yourself that pain was the price, and that you'd already paid enough not to feel it anymore. But pain doesn't work like that. It stacks, quietly, layer by layer, until it becomes who you are. And then there was the lie about control. I'm still in control. You said it after a mistake, after a job went wrong, after you ran too far, drank too much, slept too little. You told yourself you were still sharp, still capable, still the shadow they feared. But the truth crept in, slow and soft. You weren't the same. Your hands shook more. Your vision blurred in the morning. Your judgment faltered. And when you looked at yourself, truly looked, you weren't sure what you saw anymore. But saying you were in control gave you something to hold, something solid, even if it was hollow. One of the hardest lies was about being known. Someone understands me. Maybe once someone did. A lover, a brother, a friend who saw past the knife, but most left, or died, or became ghosts in your memory. And the ones who remained didn't see the real you. Not anymore. You tried to believe they did. You told yourself they could still reach you if they tried hard enough. But deep down, you knew they only saw the surface. And you didn't blame them. You'd built your life around hiding, around pretending, around making sure no one got close enough to truly understand. Another lie was about the future. I won't do this forever. You said it after every job. This is temporary. One more mission. One last coin. Then I'll stop. Then I'll leave. Then I'll find a place where I don't need to look over my shoulder. Where I can sleep through the night. Where I can grow old. You imagine that place sometimes. A cabin. A village. A field that smelled of rain. You held on to it like a lantern in the dark. But it was a dream. Because the truth is, most assassins don't retire. They vanish. They bleed out in doorways. They die with their eyes open in towns that never knew their names. And deep down, you knew that. But without the lie, the future felt like a wall. So you kept saying it, even as you packed your bag again, even as you took the next name. You lied about the past, too. I wasn't always like this. Maybe that was true once, long ago, before the hunger, before the silence, before the blade became an extension of your hand. But memory is slippery. You forget the faces. You forget your own voice. You forget what laughter sounded like when it wasn't forced. So you told yourself you had been different, that something happened to you, something outside of your control, that it wasn't your fault, and maybe it wasn't, but maybe it was. You never stayed on that thought for long. The last lie was the deepest, the one that sat below all the others. I'm still human. You said it when the guilt started to rot your chest, when you watched someone cry after the kill, when a child looked at you like they saw something broken. You told yourself you were still human. You still felt things, still wanted peace, still believed in kindness. But humanity isn't something you can claim. It's something others see in you. And you weren't sure anyone saw it anymore. So you said it for yourself, like a prayer, like a shield, like a secret. All these lies wrapped around you like armor, soft at first, then tight, then crushing. You wore them not to deceive others, but to survive yourself. Because truth, for someone like you, was too heavy, too sharp, too final. Truth would ask you to stop, to change, to mourn, and you didn't know how to do any of that. So you kept lying. Because lies, at least, were familiar, and familiarity was something to hold in the dark. One last job, the myth of redemption. It always started with a promise, a quiet voice in a dark room, a folded note passed from hand to hand, a coin laid on the table, heavier than it should be. Just one more job, they said, the last one, the one that buys you out, buys you clean, buys you gone. It sounded simple, familiar, almost comforting, like an old lie you were willing to believe just one more time. You didn't ask too many questions. You never did. That was part of the work. You learned early that questions complicated things, and complexity got people killed. The job had a name, maybe a place, maybe a date. You nodded, you left, you walked like it didn't matter, and tried not to feel the way your chest tightened when you let yourself believe it could all finally end. Because deep down, you wanted out. Not because you were afraid, but because you were tired. Tired of the silence, tired of the cold, tired of always watching doors and counting footsteps and planning for exits before you'd even sat down. You told yourself this time it would be different. This time you'd finish clean, you'd disappear, you'd leave the blade behind. You'd find a place without locks on the doors, or ghosts in the corners, or blood in the basin. But the job was never clean. Not really. The client always left something out. A detail, a trap, a piece of truth that shifted when you touched it. The target wasn't who they said they were, or the guards were double what you expected, or the timing was off by minutes that felt like hours. And suddenly, you weren't walking out with coin and a clear path. You were bleeding in a stairwell, or running through mud, or hiding in a barn that smelled like rot. You were back in it, deep in it, just like all the other times, and the dream of peace collapsed like paper in the rain. So, you told yourself, not this job, the next one. That'll be the last. That's the one that changes things. You tighten your jaw. You move on. You find the next name, the next city, the next lie. You keep the blade sharp. You keep your back to the wall. You keep telling yourself you're almost done. But the truth is, you were never close. Because no one ever retires. Not really. The ones who try are forgotten. The ones who succeed vanish. And the ones who fail end up with no one left to bury them. You've seen it. You've helped clean it up. You've walked past it like it didn't matter. But it did. It always did. Every time you saw another assassin stumble, another name disappear, another story end in silence, you told yourself you wouldn't end like that. You'd be smarter, faster, luckier. But the end was always waiting, and it never cared what you believed. Sometimes you wondered what redemption even meant. Did it mean forgiveness? From who? You had no gods left. No priest would listen. Did it mean rest? You hadn't truly rested in years. Your body worked on instinct now, half sleep, half alert, always listening, always bracing. Or did it just mean disappearing? Fading into some nameless corner of the world where no one knew you, where your past didn't follow, where no one asked why your eyes were so tired and your voice so still. You imagined it often, even when you tried not to. A small house, a river nearby, quiet mornings with no one watching. You wouldn't carry a blade there. You'd learn to grow things. You'd learn to sleep with both eyes closed. You'd let the silence mean something different. You told yourself this image was real. You told yourself you were getting closer. You told yourself it was still possible. But you never packed for it. Not really. You packed like you always had. Light, fast, cold. You took the blade. You wrapped it the same way. You wore the same boots. You moved like someone who didn't expect to stay. Because even if the dream lingered, your body remembered the truth. The truth was that you weren't done. Not yet. Maybe not ever. You told yourself other lies too. That you were in control. That you could walk away whenever you wanted. That the blood hadn't changed you. That the faces didn't follow you into sleep. But the blade always brought them back. The job always opened old wounds. And you always walked away carrying more than what you came with. The myth of the last job was strong, almost sacred. Everyone in the trade spoke of it, even if they mocked it. They all had a version, a plan, a place they'd go, a promise they'd made to themselves. But most of them never left. Most of them never stopped. The work became the rhythm, the routine, the habit. It filled the space where hope used to be. And the worst part? You started to need it. Not the violence, not the money, but the certainty, the simplicity, the clarity of the moment. A target, a path, a reason to move. Without it, everything felt too quiet, too wide, too empty. You didn't know how to live without the edge. You didn't know who you were without the mission. So you stayed in the lie. You fed it. You wrapped it in new names and new cities and told yourself you weren't like the others. But you were. You were tired. You were alone. You were trying to buy your way out with something that could never be paid in coin. And still, you waited for the next whisper, the next folded note, the next client who said the words you needed to hear. One last job. You nodded. You didn't believe them, but you nodded anyway, because the lie was softer than the truth, and it was the only thing that kept you moving. What was left? Shadows and silence. When it was over, there was no sound, no final word, no dying confession whispered into the night, no thunder, no storm, just silence. The kind that doesn't echo, the kind that waits, not heavy, not loud, just present, still. And in that stillness, something ended, though no one could say exactly what it was. There was no one there to witness it, no one to see how the last breath left the lungs, no one to mark the moment. It passed like smoke through an open window. It faded into air. It disappeared before it had a chance to settle. The body was found later, or maybe not at all. It depended on the place, on the season, on the kind of ground they died on. In some stories, they fall in an alley. In others, in a field. Sometimes they die on the road, still moving, still trying to outrun something they never spoke about. And when they're found, if they're found, no one knows who they were. Just a face no one remembers. A knife too worn to shine. A pouch with no coin. Boots with torn soles. Hands rough with memory. There is no name to carve, no family to call. The villagers bury them quietly if they bother at all. One man says he saw them pass through town 3 nights earlier. Quiet, strange eyes, kept to themselves. Another shrugs. Said they seemed tired, looked cold. No one saw a weapon. No one thought they were anything more than a traveler. Which, in a way, they were. They'd been traveling their whole life. But not toward anything. Only away. Away from the past. Away from the work. Away from the weight they couldn't name. When they died, there was no one left who knew their story. And that was the point. They'd built their life around erasure, around being unseen, around moving through the world like wind through trees. You might feel the shift, but you never knew where it came from. And when it was gone, you questioned if it was ever real at all. Some would say that's a tragedy, that to live and die without legacy is a kind of failure, that a life with no name, no record, no mourners is not a life worth living. But they didn't see the whole thing. They didn't see what came before. They didn't feel the weight that was carried, the decisions made in silence, the hands that shook after every job, even if they pretended not to. They didn't see the way sleep refused to stay, the way every kindness was met with hesitation, the way every sound, every breath, every touch was measured, judged, weighed. What was left wasn't nothing. It just wasn't visible. It lived in the places they passed through, in the quiet ways they noticed things others missed, in the space they made by not being present anymore. Some bartender remembered a face, maybe. Someone who didn't talk much, but tipped fairly. Someone who watched the door, but never caused trouble. Maybe a child remembered the shape of their eyes. Not the color, but the way they didn't blink. Maybe a dog followed them once, sat beside them in the cold, and never got shooed away. That was something. That mattered. But it didn't leave a mark that could be touched. And in the end, that was all they had. Shadows, silence, the hum of memory in places no one looked too closely, the feel of a path well traveled but never claimed, the scent of ash on cold nights, the faint echo of breath in a room left empty too long. Somewhere, maybe, someone wondered about them, wondered who they were, wondered what they wanted, wondered what drove someone to become a ghost in their own lifetime. But the wondering didn't last. People have short memories, towns have short lives, and the world, brutal as it is, does not pause for men and women who die alone. Still, it's worth asking. What does it mean to live without being seen? To take life and give nothing in return? To walk through the world carrying silence as a shield and solitude as a companion? Was it a choice? Or something closer to fate? Did they want to be forgotten? Or did they simply not know how to be remembered? There are no answers, only echoes. The job took many things: names, faces, sleep, time, love. But more than anything, it took shape. The shape of who they might have been if none of it had happened. That version faded early. The one who laughed freely, who dreamed, who stood in sunlight without fear of being watched. That version was lost long ago. Replaced by something harder, quieter, sharper, but not empty. Never empty. Because even in silence, they felt. Even in shadow, they remembered. Even if the world forgot them, they hadn't forgotten themselves. Not fully, not yet. In the quiet moments between jobs, they still hoped. Not loudly, not with words, but with actions. With the way they let a child pass unharmed. With the way they left coin on a windowsill they could have taken. With the way they looked at the sky and wondered what it would be like to watch stars without counting guards. That hope, small, buried, stubborn, was what remained. And now, that hope is what's left. A breath that didn't vanish. A step that didn't echo. A life that didn't leave stories, but still had meaning. You won't read their name in books. You won't find their blade in a museum. You won't walk by a statue carved in their likeness. But if you listen, if you walk long enough, down quiet roads and cold paths and city alleys where no one speaks too loudly, you might feel something. A hush, a shift, a shadow just at the edge of your vision. And maybe, just maybe, that's them. What was left, what they became, what we were never meant to see.